Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Chris Bates has over 14 years of dedicated exploration, immersing himself in the realms of diet, lifestyle, and mindset to achieve the maximum impact on the quality of life. Bates meticulously analyzes his results, employing recovery statistics, intake and outtake trackers, DEXA scans, blood work, and more. He seeks to discover the optimal balance of effort that sustains motivation and equilibrium. A true scientist in the purest sense, Chris thrives on learning from the unknown while consistently taking action through experimentation. Previously, he spent 3 years working alongside Dr. Paul Saladino as the lead health coach for Heart and Soil. Today, Bates works closely with individuals, particularly men, guiding them on a one-on-one basis to pursue optimal physiological, psychological, and interpersonal health. His clients, often aspiring to be the most capable partners and businessmen, benefit from his expertise in designing custom-tailored lifestyles that align with their goals and address their unique challenges. Central to Bates's approach is the encouragement of self-sustainability, typically achieved through individual experimentation and discovery. Chris Bates, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
It's good to be here, Casey. And as you was reading that intro, I was like, oh my gosh, it's so long. Who wrote that? And I guess the answer is me. Sorry.
That's fine. You've done a lot of stuff. So
Yeah.
you've definitely earned a long introduction. Question number one, what is the best diet?
Oh, man. I think it depends. Next question. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess we were talking a little bit before we got on air. I think whatever approach, and I like to call it approach because it's really more of like a lifestyle than a diet, and I'm sure you believe that too, is what a person feels best doing and what's the most sustainable to continue to help them take strides towards their goals. Now, in my personal opinion, because that's what I would suggest to everyone kind of reflect on their own, my personal opinion is I felt best on animal-based. So I've done over a dozen diets or lifestyles or eating approaches. Each has been for a period of 6 to 12 months. It's been very disciplined. Not all of them, but the majority I've gotten, blood work before and after, DEXA scan, taken into account macros, micros, caloric exertion, all these kinds of things. And animal-based was the one that after a year, I felt so good. I've now been doing it for maybe 4.5 years. And so that's the way that I'm eating. But part of my talk at Hack Your Health, because we were talking about that a little bit too, was to encourage people to experiment and not just take somebody else's word for what they should do. So I would be a hypocrite if I didn't mention that, because I think animal-based is a great place to start for anyone who's looking to try and optimize their health, but it could take them to other places. And I think I'd be okay with that. I'd advocate for that.
That's a very thoughtful answer to a nonsense question to start. Man, I love it. I love getting to meet you at Hack Your Health this year was phenomenal. We were in a breakout session, and the person who was you named him. I can't remember his name. Who was going to speak wasn't able to make it. What was his name?
Yeah, I don't want to call him out, but he's a good dude.
No
he just couldn't make it.
Yeah, it's all good. I figured got like a flat tire or something, couldn't make it in. And so everybody's like sitting around waiting, and you just kind of took the stage and said, okay, he's not going to show up, but I'm going to stand in and I'll just take questions. And I was really excited to see what questions you would get and how you would respond. And I was so impressed. You did such a great job contextually listening to people and explaining those nuances. Again, we're all out asking the question, what's the best diet, when it's completely varied across the board. And as somebody who has experimented, like you said, rigorously for so many years on a lot of different things, you do a really great job of bringing that nuance to the conversation, which I really appreciate.
That's very kind of you, man. It means a lot, because I have not always been eloquent by any means. And I think every time that I go through a Q&A or a panel or a podcast, I'm always like, oh my gosh, I don't even know if what I said made sense. So that's good feedback to hear. And, the audience there asked some really good questions. And one of them that I had to really think through, which is pertaining to your first, even if it's playful, I think it's a pertinent question, is, okay, animal-based sounds great. What about if I'm pre-diabetic? And it's like, okay, that's a really good point, right? Because then obviously carbohydrates and glucose and metabolism and all these other things are different when you're pre-diabetic or diabetic or something like that. And so that was nice that question came up. And so I do think there's a ton of nuances, and that's why it makes it, whether it's a silly question to start it off or a sincere question makes it a really difficult question to answer with any kind of a blanket statement.
Yeah, sure. Well, again, I really appreciate that. Looking forward to this conversation. I think we're going to cover a lot of ground. You've been very busy with a rebrand and a lot of content coming out. I love your stuff on social media, which is great. How did you first get into the health space to begin with?
You know, I went through in middle school a really, really tough era. Middle school is where, at least for me and the people that I grew up with, you start to become self-aware enough to understand your inadequacies, and you don't have the wisdom to realize that that's just part of growing up. So I was really hard on myself, and it led to self-loathing, depression, and I actually considered ending my life. Uh, and that lasted for a few years. And although I never technically pulled the trigger, although I got close once, I out the other end, I started to ask myself, why am I feeling this way? Like outside of the self-loathing, because there is some mental health and there's some reframes there. And I said, you know what? I'm not really pushing myself. And I started to realize that mental health was related to physical health. I was probably like 16, 17. And then shortly after that, that's when all the experiments started. I'm like, okay, I think that the best way to protect myself from being too hard on myself is not only to try things and achieve things and learn and be healthy and look healthy, but to support my mental state through micronutrients and movement and all these other things, sunshine, all these other things. And so it was really the physical health. I didn't have any maladies or any massive struggles. Like I'd been too skinny, then I got too fat. I've gone through these body composition changes, but I'm fortunate enough that I never had some illness that was just completely debilitating, like a lot of people do. So it was actually mental health is what got me into the physiological health side of things.
Yeah, I love that you made the connection between mental health and physical health. Hindsight being 2020, when you look back on, the way you were raised, the way you were brought up, the foods you were eating, can you identify those things as being the active kind of like detriments to your mental health?
That's a really fascinating question. I don't know if I've ever been asked that before. I was having sometimes it was a standard American diet, and then other times we would get local meat and eggs from because we lived in a rural area, and my dad loved to cook on the grill, and so my parents did their best to give us nutritious foods. But this was also when like things like the pizza rolls and dino nuggets and like the schwans. I don't know if you had the frozen
Oh
food
yeah.
truck would go around. That's when that
Yep.
was starting to get big. And so sometimes it was Stouffer's mac and cheese. And when both my parents were working and they're both very hard workers, it's like sometimes all mom would occasionally make a great dinner for us, but sometimes is all she could do to put something in the microwave in between piano lessons while my dad was working 70 hours a week on it, for the business he owned. And so, I don't that harbor any resentment to them at all. But looking back, there were probably some nutritional inadequacies when I would eat a whole box of toaster strudel in high school in the morning. It's like that's probably not laced with those evolutionarily consistent micronutrients and things like that. But I don't know how much that had an impact on my mental health. If I had to wager, I would say that it was honestly my perspective. Just like being, and I think a lot of this isn't unique to me. I think a lot of us, whether it's middle school, high school, college, or as full-fledged adults right now listening to this, we are really harsh on ourselves. And so I think I was my own biggest enemy. I'm sure malnutrition or maybe not, or like the sad diet probably exacerbated that. But I think the origin was really just my own perspective.
Okay. I hope we can make a little bit of a diversion here because I think this is an important point. I want to get back to your story, but it's something you said on my friend Tony's podcast, the Primal Foundations podcast, one of my favorites. Love Tony. I know you do as well.
It's great.
Where
Yeah.
you were talking about it was along the lines of like wanting to crush every like element in your life. And we're kind of taught that, and like, especially people that are like us and small business owners, we're trying to kill it in all areas all the time. And I see it also in the physical world. Like people have these goals, and it's not only a weight, but it's like they've got pictures on their walls. It's like
Mm,
all the Instagram models, like I want to look like that. It's like you don't understand what that person had to do to be photo ready. And like
mm.
I feel like we don't have realistic kind of expectations for ourselves. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think it ties in perfectly with what we were talking about. I was seeing other kids that were like good at these sports that I had never tried. So how was I supposed to compare myself to them, right? Like that was their whole life and they didn't have things that I had, right? Or like I was into music and that was kind of like a nerdy thing. So I even though I had a talent that a lot of these other kids didn't have, I was comparing. And as we know, comparison is, the what is a thief of joy. And so zooming out to now and what you're talking about with Tony, which yeah, I love that guy. We had a great conversation. I think people see these bodybuilders. I think they see the David Goggins of the world or MMA fighters and pro athletes, and then they try to compare themselves to them. And again, like you said, you have no idea what that person had to do to get there, whether they were sacrificing balance, fulfillment, joy, health, maybe, even though they look healthy, there's some aspects of health that they probably sacrificed. And so I just think the only way for us to preserve mental health and also push towards our goals is to compete with a previous iteration of ourselves as opposed to anyone else. And so I'm actually in the middle of doing that right now. I was focusing on work and hack your health and moving and a few other things. And I didn't really let my health go, but I did as much as I have ever done since this became important to me. I was like, oh, I'm not in my peak physique anymore. And so then I looked 3 years ago. I was like, okay, what was my body fat? What was I doing? What was I lifting? What was my routine? It's like, all right, I'm going to beat that guy. And so that's exciting because I turned 33 Sunday. And to think that I can beat the younger version of myself is like a fun goal. But if I'm comparing myself to some, bodybuilder poster I have on the wall, and he's like, it's his show day or picture day or whatever, that is not a realistic image for me to set. And I don't think social media really helps us with that, right? Even before things are augmented, because they are altered, right? Whether it's filters or whatever. I think that just adds to the already existing issue that we compare ourselves by nature to other people.
Yeah, I like that. You mentioned David Goggins. I appreciate that in this conversation with Tony, you guys talked about like 75 hard, and
Yeah.
he talked about doing like Ironman or like the Tour de France just finished. And you think, wow, these guys are the pinnacle of health, riding their bikes, at the crazy watt per kilo, ratios going up these mountains. It's like, no, 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 this is not health. What you're looking at right here is not very healthy. Trust me, it's really tough, and there's value in doing hard things, but it's not it's not like the best thing for you to try to like force so much on
Yeah.
yourself all the time because of those expectations.
Yeah. I think if you're obsessed with something and you love it and you want to go all in on it, I don't see a problem with that. But I think if you're a person who prefers balance, but you just want to achieve things that are important to you while maintaining balance, you don't need to emulate these people that are extreme. There's nothing wrong with extremes because I think that's how innovation has come out. That's why we have experts. That's why there's these people. But I don't think we are all that person. Or if we are in different ways. So it's just really important to delineate yourself from that.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate that explanation. Let's get back to your personal story. After you feel like you kind of came out of that really dark time, how did the experimentation part of things kind of come about? When did you decide you wanted to start tweaking your diet and see how that was going to affect you?
I became really obsessed with. It was funny. We were just talking about bodybuilding, like the whole bodybuilding.com, because that was probably, I'm trying to think of what year that was. It's probably like 2006 or 2007 when I started to get into this stuff. So I was also researching supplements, and instead of buying the pre-made like pre-workout like C4 whatever it was back then, I would look up the individual ingredients, and I started to learn how to dissect studies so I could figure out, okay, which one of these ingredients has efficacy, and then can I buy these ingredients individually and make my own version of pre-workout that might be better and cheaper because I was on a really tight budget. So yeah, I think I was like 17 or 18 when I started doing that. So it started with a pre-workout, which I don't even use anymore, and lifting because I was always really skinny and it was so hard for me to put on muscle no matter how much I ate with the sad American diet, which I know a lot of people would love that, but it's equal curse of the counterpart. And so I was like, okay, how do I optimize putting on muscle? Because I want to not only be proud of myself for me, but I want to be able to attract a pretty girl and date a pretty girl that's like a good girl that has a good family. And I feel like I need to be in good shape and good health in order to do that. So that was kind of like my first drive, was more workouts and pre-workout. But then it morphed into being very diet heavy because as I was doing research, I saw, oh, diet and lifestyle actually affects your input, your investment into working out. And then so slowly my focal point began to shift towards lifestyle over just working out. But a lot of experiments have still fallen under that umbrella, like everything from CrossFit to the German volume training to like 4x4 calisthenics, all kinds of stuff. I've really enjoyed trying it all. But the diet and the diets and the biohacking, the lifestyle really started to take priority over that.
Got it. Okay. And if I'm thinking about mostly diet experimentations with that time frame in mind, I'm thinking that you probably went more plant-based at first. Is that the kind of the direction you were thinking as far as like this is the healthiest thing to do?
You know, that's what a lot of people do. Like if you take, especially from working at Heart and Soil, I saw, probably around 13,000 different anecdotes come through in my time there. And most people start with plant-based and then they evolve. And it's not like a natural progression, but if we were to label one, it is like, vegetarian, vegan, and then it's like, oh, maybe paleo, then keto, then carnivore, and then sometimes animal-based, depending on the person. That was what I saw a lot. For me, it was very different. I think I started out in kind of like a Mediterranean approach, and I did pescatarian, fruitarian. I don't remember the exact order. Then paleo, vegetarian, vegan, back to paleo, and then animal based or something along those lines. I did try keto somewhere in there too, but it wasn't keto like you and I know it. It was like, I like to call it dirty keto, where there's like a lot of processed foods, but they're technically keto. And it was like, I lost some weight, but it's not high performance, not high quality of life at all.
Yeah, gotcha. Your experience on the vegan diet, being a hard gainer, somebody that had to work tremendously hard to gain muscle, I'm assuming that's something you noticed, a muscle loss.
Oh, abhorrent muscle loss. And
Wow.
I was not eating a full raw vegan diet, but my goal was to eat a majority raw vegan diet. And so I had this massive Tupperware I bought at Costco, like the plastic things that are, however long, what is it, like 10 inches by 10 inches with the gray see-through lids. And I would fill that thing with steamed like lentils and sweet potatoes and Brussels sprouts and quinoa and beans. And then tofu was like the only processed vegan food I would eat. And I could never eat enough. I would just be shoveling my mouth in between. I had a remote sales position at this very like, kind of classic office job, like think Dunder Mifflin or, something like that. And I was just like, drive around and I would just shovel my face the whole time I was on the road and I was back in the office. I could never eat enough. And I would go to the gym, I'd push myself hard, I'd get good sleep. And yeah, the muscle just over the course of 12 months, it just melted off. I probably lost 20 pounds and I wasn't trying to. I was trying to be in a caloric surplus. I was trying to see if I could build muscle and the opposite happened.
Wow, that's wild. I think we just had a little Zoom glitch
Oh,
for a
yeah.
second.
Sorry.
No, we're good. I think we're back on track. I'll edit that later. Yeah, the weirdest thing, dude, you're describing that. I just got bloated. That was so weird. I don't even know.
Really?
I just got bloated from hearing about all the fiber you were eating. It's crazy.
The post traumatic bloat syndrome.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Wild. So weird. Yeah. So I remember eating that way as well, and you do just feel ravenous all the time. You really
Mhm.
can't get enough, and your body's not accessing very much. Yeah. So you stuck with it? You said for 8 months, 12 months?
12 months
Okay.
I think vegetarian was probably 6, but then trying to eat raw vegan, I was very stubborn and I wanted to kind of like be like, all right, if this is a thing, I have to see it through and see for myself. And then after that, I was like, all right, I'm never doing this again. Never doing this again.
Got it. Okay. Um, did you have any oxalate dump issues, by the way?
Not that I know of.
Cool.
At the time, I wasn't as well versed with that, so I wasn't really looking for it. And looking back, yeah, it's hard to say for sure. So none that I know of. But
Got it.
what's interesting is it was my buddy's 30th birthday, and he was like, "All right, I'm gonna have everyone to a Brazilian steakhouse." And I'm like, "Great, I'm right at 12 months for this, but like I'm too stubborn. I'm not ready to throw in the towel. So I'll go to support him. And then I ended up sitting down with him, and, they're having a great time, and all this meat is just circling me, just being super tantalizing. And I mean, and it's not even like I don't even have to cut it myself, right? There's these servers that are offering you meat, and it's just the best meat in the world, and they're ready to put it on your plate. And so I caved and I ate, I shit you not. And I would know because I was shitting a lot as a vegan. I ate 3 pounds ish of meat, and for the first time in it was probably like 2 days shy of 12 months. And then my ex-wife, my wife at the time, said, "Are you sure you're going to be okay?" So we got into the car, and she's looking at me as if like a bomb about to go off. And then it hit me. I was like, wow, I haven't felt this good in a long time. So we're giggling about it because I thought I might, you know, soil my pants, or who knows, have a heart attack. Who knows what would happen? At that point in my life, I didn't know what I knew now, but I felt so alive and I was wired all night long. And now it makes sense, right? Because if you're devoid of these specific nutrients only found in animal foods, and you deprive yourself for so long, and then you get a lot of that, of course you're going to feel energetic, of course you're going to feel great. But at the time I didn't have that kind of ideology. I didn't have this attachment to carnivore or animal based, but I remember that it still stands out to me. Like I can visualize it as if it's a painting or a cinematic film of that feeling of it was wild, man.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm so glad the story went in that direction. If you would have said you went to a Brazilian steakhouse and only eaten salad, that's like blasphemy, man.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Terrible.
Or I ate meat and then like shit my pants and felt terrible. Then it would have been like a different story too,
Exactly, too.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. Wow. Okay. So eventually you made your way to animal based and carnivore and that kind of realm, and you got mixed up with the heart and soil thing, which I find super, super interesting. Tell us about that process and what that was actually like.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story, and to avoid getting too deep in the details, I had been working in the family business, which was residential mortgages, and I loved working with my brother and my father, and I loved serving people. But there was something, and I'm sure you've been in a situation like this, and the listeners probably have too, where you're doing something because it makes sense, but it doesn't really light you up. And I had been doing these diet experiments for some time, and I had started looking into animal based, and then followed Paul Saladino. And this was shortly before he went on Rogan. So this was before he blew up, and before Heart and Soil was really that big. I think they only had 5 people working there at the time. But then I started following the Heart and Soil pretty early on, and I saw that they had a position, and I was like, okay, it's 2020. uh, I don't have any desire to be, you know, mixed up in all this COVID stuff or in the industry that I'm in. I don't really feel very passionate. And although I have my health under wraps, I want to do more. I want to have a mission. I want to have this sense of fulfillment, and that I'm working to change the world for the better. And so I just applied for Heart and Soil when they posted a job listing on Instagram. But I saw all these people liking and commenting it that were like doctors, nutritionists, really big influencers. I was like, there's no way that I'm going to get this job. But I stayed up all night writing a cover letter and tailoring my resume truthfully to why I wanted to be there. And so the guy that was really my advocate, his name is Dylan Randolph. He was Paul's PA before Paul was ever Carnivore MD. And he really, you don't hear about him a lot, but he was the one who really helped get Heart and Soil up and running. He said that my cover letter spoke to his heart, and so I got a call with him and the CEO and the COO, and they flew me out, and I took holiday or took leave from my job with the family for 2 weeks, and just worked from Paul's house before they actually had a headquarters, because there's only a few people, and heard about the mission and threw some ideas out there. And it was just like a spiritual fit is almost what I wanted to say, but not in terms of like religion, but in terms of like we were kindred spirits, and we wanted the same thing. I just got so fired up that 2 weeks later, they offered me the job before I left, and 2 weeks later I moved out there. Just hauled my entire life in a U-Haul behind my 4Runner with my 2 dogs from Virginia to Austin, Texas, not knowing a single thing about Austin. And then Heart and Soil is my life for almost 3 years, and every second of that was well spent. But to summarize the whole story, it's like I did not see myself A, getting the job, or B, switching industries or careers like that. And for anyone listening, this is when you have a desire that's fueled by passion, as cliche as it sounds, anything is possible. And I think about how different my life would be if I didn't have the courage to throw myself out there. And a job resume and a cover letter in half a night, yeah, I was up till 5 a.m., but like, what is that in terms of what happens, the domino effect for the rest of your life? So I know that's not necessarily where we're going, but I wanted to throw that out there because I think we all have these, select few moments in life where we can follow our passion or take a little bit of a risk. And it's really not that big of a risk. And the possibilities from that when it works out are endless. So I just encourage anyone to do that.
Wonderful. I absolutely love that. That must have been an amazing time in your life. Heart and Soil, for the listener who doesn't know what that is, what were you guys doing?
So Heart and Soil was founded by Paul Saladino, and we were desiccating, which means freeze drying organs. It's not the same as defecating. They sound very similar, and we often got customer reviews like the defecated bull testicle was my favorite. It's so funny, man. Yeah. But it's just a method of freeze drying organs to preserve bioavailability. And so that's what we were doing, but that was the product, so that's where the money came in. But there was a huge emphasis, which is partially why I got hired, to guide people on how to use the products, how to try animal-based, and how to just solve their health issues. So as the lead health coach, well, technically my title was health success team lead, but that's what it was. We were designing a variety of resources, a community, emails, links, references to help people take their health into their own hands. And that's why I fell in love with the company. Yet I still take the supplements. I believe in organ consumption by and large, but it wasn't so much, pushing supplements that got me really interested. It was this idea like, oh, wow, this, out of all my experiments, this way of life has served me so well. I would love to guide others to trying it and seeing if it works for them.
Yeah, that's amazing. I was going to ask you if you still use the supplements. I know they're very, very high quality. So
Yeah.
that's good to know. Interesting. Okay, so if you started in 2020, you were probably there when Paul was kind of going through a bit of a transition himself, as he had been promoting a very strict version of the carnivore diet, with a high amount of organ intake, and then kind of transition over to what you and I call animal based at this point. So
Yeah.
I don't want you to like speak for him, but for you and
Mhm.
your experience, what was that like?
So I got connected with Heart and Soil in late 2020, but I think by the time I got through the interview process and got there, it was early on in 2021. And so it was the exact time that he was going to Costa Rica and he was starting to eat more carbohydrates. I didn't get to work. He came back and I got to, be around him more. But when I first started there, he kind of had already taken leave and been traveling to Tanzania and then Costa Rica and these things. So I didn't get to witness that firsthand. But I do know that it seemed like somewhat of a conflict, right? Because it's like, oh, this is what I professed, but I'm experiencing these things. So honestly, as someone who believed in him as a podcaster, but also believed in the lifestyle, I was very happy that he had the courage to say, hey, I did this differently because I was feeling this way. Because a lot of people just double down on things, right? And Paul, knowing him personally and professionally, he can be somewhat extreme and defiant at times. And I say that as someone who's also that way. So it's like, it's not slander or anything. So I think it's exceptional that he chose to not double down when it could have been easier to do so. So I was very, proud of the business and Paul in that moment.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And again, him doing what he was doing is awesome. And yeah, I do respect the fact that he was able to be open and honest about it. I'm assuming as a company, you would have gotten lots of pushback or at least a lot of anecdote on how that went. I mean, essentially, you're taking I always wonder about this. You're taking people who are probably have some level of carbohydrate or sugar addiction. That's really a majority. I don't know about a majority. It's a lot of the people who make it onto like a carnivore type diet. And then
Yeah.
it's like reintroducing a lot of fruit or fruit juice or something that's really high in sugar. And
Mhm.
so my experience with coaching carnivores through Dr. Baker's site for several years was that if people tried that, oftentimes they could re-trigger a sugar addiction, not
Mm.
necessarily that the fruit was the problem, but you ate the fruit and then you wanted candy bars afterward.
Yeah.
What was your experience like as a company, I guess, at the time, as far as like feedback, pushback, anything like that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I guess I should also, a really good question rather, and I should also make sure the listener knows what Paul did differently and what he was feeling. I mean, I'm sure some people know, but just to make that clear, he was having a lot of symptoms of what I would probably label as electrolyte imbalances. and also an increase in fasting blood glucose and insulin from, he believes, lack of carbohydrates, especially with a very active lifestyle. And obviously there's a ton of nuance to this, and there's a ton of variables. And so what he was saying is like maybe having low toxicity carbohydrates, which he would identify as sweet fruit, unsweet fruit like avocado, squash, zucchini, pumpkin, stuff like that. They're technically fruits because there's meat around the seed, but they're lower in terms of toxins and all these other things, especially compared to legumes and nuts and seeds and leaves and so forth. So he was saying there is a place to have carbohydrates, A, if you tolerate them, B, if you're active, and C, if you're experiencing maybe electrolyte issues or an elevated blood glucose or decrease in thyroid function, hormone levels, that kind of thing. So clearly a lot of nuance. So I mean, you hit the nail on the head. We got a ton of pushback, right? I mean, his book is literally called The Carnivore Code. And he's like, hey, have some low toxicity carbs. It ain't no thing. And people are like, that, I'm calling bullshit on that. And so I had a lot of productive conversations, and I got to see a lot of anecdotes. And I'm glad that people pushed back, because whenever you believe something ardently, especially if that's your mission, you need to have your echo chamber challenged a little bit. And so some people ask questions like, oh, you know what? They keep bringing up the Randall cycle. I should probably look into this and see what this is all about. So I learned a ton about everything from ATP to the Randall cycle to different variations of why someone's blood glucose might be elevated. So personally, I learned a ton. But what's interesting is if I had to be somewhat ambiguous using percentages to share what I saw, is I would say that 95% of people who added carbohydrates back in what we would say were reasonable amounts based off of their context, their scenario, and their activity, they almost, 95% of the time, almost always saw an improvement in quality of life, an improvement in energy, improvement in body composition, improvement in blood work and stuff like that. However, this is all self-reported. So it's like we didn't have the blood work in our hands because there was some kind of liability issues there. We're not doctors. There's all kinds of other things that could have affected this, placebo effect, so on and so forth. But the grand majority of the time, people seem to find higher quality of health. However, there was still a camp of people who said, you know what, I respectfully disagree with the doctor on this one. So I'll just continue to be strict carnivore. And then their health most of the time was pretty fine as well. But there were some people, it wasn't uncommon that we had people who had been keto or carnivore for a long time with elevated blood glucose, lower thyroid function, lower hormone levels, that adding a reasonable amount of low toxicity carbohydrates did restore those levels back to normal, and that kind of thing. So it's hard for me, having lived through that, to not believe that some amount of carbohydrates is beneficial for the majority of people. But then I was also perplexed at some people who didn't need any carbohydrates at all and didn't experience the downsides that I saw in other people being carnivore for so long. So, in the end, I know nothing, but it was really fun to observe it all.
I would think that would be fascinating to observe it all. The 95% number with those caveats that you talked about, that's way higher than I would have assumed. And again, in my experience with coaching people, it seemed like there would have been more that, again, the most common thing I would see is the triggering of a sugar addiction that leads to other things that are not, low toxicity carbohydrate. But yeah, that must have been a very interesting experience. And I guess you kind of answered my next question already with kind of signs and symptoms that you were mentioning. I like to consider a carnivore diet anything like hyper carnivore. It's 75% or more in nature of your calories are coming from animal foods. Past that point, I don't like to get too tied into the semantics, and we seem to have like infighting in the community of like what's the very strictest and lion diet or not lion diet, or you had a blueberry scenario, not carnivore. I don't really care about that kind of stuff. But what signs and symptoms would you say if somebody has been in this world, they're moving toward animal based, what would be some signs and symptoms maybe that somebody should try a more stricter version of carnivore versus like, oh, you are fine to add in some more of these like fruits and vegetables because a strict version of a carnivore diet might not be the best for you?
Yeah, I think for most of the people we saw, and to add another caveat, not everyone was coming from strict carnivore. Sometimes they were coming from keto. And as we know, there's a lot of variations under that. And so I don't know how that might confound, elevated blood glucose and all these other things. But I think the primary one we saw was elevated blood glucose. So, and the timeline I want to say is probably 4 to 6 months or more of being pretty diligent on strict carnivore, and people saw elevated blood glucose. Similar timeline for seeing higher TSH and lower T3 and T4. And for people who aren't familiar, that means your thyroid isn't functioning as optimally as it could be. And granted, we didn't always have blood work, and we were always getting the blood work self-reported. So it's not like I got to look at the labs and these kinds of things. And like I said, hormones in general, but especially lower testosterone was interesting for people who had been strict carnivore for a long time and then added carbohydrates back in, and it bumped up. Sometimes SHBG, which I'm sure you know what it is, but for those who don't, it's sex hormone binding globulin. It is something that binds to the same receptors that testosterone does. So even if you have enough testosterone, it makes it more difficult for your body to utilize it. And so that would typically go down when people added carbohydrates in too. And since I've left Heart and Soil and I do blood work with my clients, I have seen that to be the case the majority of the time as well. But here's some of my theories about this too. I think the people who are in more stressful situations tend to need a little more carbohydrates to battle the negative byproducts of perpetual high stress. So I've seen a lot more people be strict carnivore and successful when they don't have a lot of mental stress or environmental stress, whether that's toxins, air quality, water, whatever, what have you. So that's something I haven't seen it enough that I could say like that's the answer, but I started to see a trend that I found interesting there. And the other part of it too is activity. If people were doing a lot of running, biking, CrossFit, HIIT, it seemed like their hormones and their overall sense of energy and quality of life was improved when they had a marginal amount of carbohydrates. Whereas if they were more like, traditional weightlifters or walking a lot and not doing a bunch of like high intensity interval training-esque activities, they didn't seem to need them as much. And so that's another trend that I saw. And then the last thing I'll say on this is I probably should identify the carbohydrate range, right? I think a lot of people, when they say low carbs, it's like 50, 60, 70 or lower, right? Some people are like zero carb or whatever, it's extreme. But like when I'm seeing people coming in from carnivore, it's probably, 50-ish, maybe a little more or lower. And then for people in animal-based, it seemed like there were two categories. There were people who did better in like the 100 to 150 range, which isn't crazy. And then there's people that were so active, or those other variables, they scaled it up to like 250 plus and they felt better. And I don't know why those were the three different groups, but I started to see people grouped into those sections of carbohydrates with, again, the overview that the majority of those carbohydrates were coming from fruits, unsweet fruits, dairy, honey, and sometimes white rice and sweet potatoes when people tolerated it, but not always.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, I really appreciate all those theories, and I've seen some of that stuff myself, so that makes a lot of sense. And you left Heart and Soil and got into coaching yourself. I know you wanted to make more of an impact on the one-on-one level, and as this is relating to all of the things we're already talking about and your Hack Your Health talk that you gave, the experimentation, as you're working with a client, where do you start as far as some of this experimentation? Do you always start with labs, or are there other ways that you like to address some of the direction you want to take with somebody?
I like labs because you just don't know what you don't know. Obviously, nothing is perfect, including lab work. It can be finicky. And so you have to take everything as a snapshot and with a grain of salt. But I really like labs because it points us in the right direction. But I also like to get things that are less metric oriented and more conceptual or intrinsic motivation oriented. So then in conjunction with labs, we kind of look at overview of lifestyle. And then I reverse engineer their 3-year vision. And I ask them some deep questions that they might not even have asked themselves in a hot moment. And then we say, okay, how can we cross-index all of this and build out a daily and weekly routine that leaves room for fun, pleasure, and play, but still crosses off the actionable items we need to achieve in order to advance towards better health and this 3-year vision. And so those are kind of the things I like to start off with. And a lot of times blood work will tell me, okay, what do macros need to look like? How intense can we go with our routine in terms of lifting and activity in general, and also supplementation and that kind of stuff? Where do we need to be? And so, yeah, that's how
Got
we
it.
start off.
Got it. Okay, perfect. So for somebody who's out there who may be looking to change their life in any given way, and they know they want to make improvements, but it feels like overwhelming. Like they feel like they need to make so many at once. How do you keep things kind of bite-sized for people so that they can achieve their goals and break things down to be very simple, but also be very impactful over time?
I'm gonna list off a few things, and it's going to seem like a long list, but I promise that it's more bite-sized than it sounds. If I look at everyone I've worked with since Heart and Soil, everyone I've worked with prior to, and everyone I've worked with there, everything boils down to eating whole foods, prioritizing sleep, which means consistent bed and wake times, movement, sunlight, socializing, fulfillment, and stress management. And I think some of those last year intertwined. So again, I know that sounds like a lot, but if you ask yourself, what am I doing every day? Obviously, you have to pay the bills somehow. Sometimes you work for someone else, sometimes you have your own business, whatnot. That's a given. There's nothing you can do about that. But what about your free time? What are you doing with your free time? You do need to have things that are not productive, because what I've noticed with people is we get in this achieving mindset, and we think, oh, if it doesn't have to do with my sleep or my health or my body composition or whatever, if I'm not refining a skill, then I don't want to do it. But that's not sustainable, at least what I found. And so people's hormones and their body composition and their energy start to suffer if they don't have these outlets of fun, of adventure, of things that you might not label as productive, but they are productive in terms of they provide balance to the equation. And so again, let's come back to your original question. If you were taking care of the basics, right? If you make some exceptions to your routine, I think that's really powerful. I think that's really great. But you have to be like, this week I had fulfillment. This week I wasn't overly stressed. This week I adhered to a way of eating that makes me feel good. This week I got movement and I feel like I pushed myself. This week I had meaningful conversation or connection with people that I care about. And that's 80% of the battle. I know it sounds maybe oversimplified, but that's really it. And as long as you're making exceptions to the standard that give you some sense of liberty or freedom or excitement or adventure, then that's the cherry on top, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay. That was really well explained. I love that. One thing I really like about your story is something you kind of alluded to earlier when you made the move to Heart and Soil, that the importance of following our heart, following our bliss, whatever is calling us, and going in that direction. And oftentimes it leads us into things we could have never predicted, we could have never expected, which again, with your story and your work currently, I'm guessing you would have never assumed you have gotten into the coaching that you're doing now. Tell us about how that journey led you to where you are today and the kind of work that you're doing now.
These all of your questions and your facilitation is so insightful, so I really appreciate that. And I mean, for me to think about it logically, so I can tell you're really good at hosting and facilitating. I never would have thought I would have been here, and I honestly don't know if I dreamed that I would have been here. You know, some people have this dream, like, this is what I want to do. Like, they pop out of their mother's womb and they're like, I'm going to be an entrepreneur. Like, I didn't know that. You know, I didn't know until I went to work for Heart and Soil, and I realized, oh, I can't work anywhere ever again because I believe in this mission. I can't go back to the corporate world, but I also want to do things differently. I want to do them my own way. So I have one option, and I'm very excited about that option, but I did not see it coming. Didn't see it coming a mile away. But once you work with people and you do something that you're really passionate about, then that becomes the epicenter of the plan going forward. And so when I left Heart and Soil, um, I I gave them like a 32-day heads up because, you know, I was in leadership. I'd been there since pretty much the end of the beginning phase, and I wanted to do right by them because they were my family, and I still believed in the mission and in the product and in the company and the community. But I just went all in on the coaching things. I didn't have clients lined up. I just had a dream, and I said, I'm going to do it because I've always done experiments. So why is business going to be any different? And so it made sense to transition to helping people try animal based. But then just like with my diet experiments and my lifestyle experiments, I wasn't happy with just trying that. So I said, okay, what would make this more interesting? It's like, oh, I'm going to double down on hormones and blood work and learn a lot more about that and help people with that, and hopes to help them with quality of life, overall health, and body composition. But after a few months, I wasn't content with that. It's like, that's not, I love this is part of it, but it's not the thing. And so then I started helping people with more of like a pseudo life coaching with an emphasis on health. But then it became more about battling stress and overwhelm. And then, so I've gone through, in 14 or 15 months, I've gone through 4 different phases. And then finally, just a few months ago, hit me. And it's like, I believe in holistic health a lot more than just, diet, lifestyle, metrics. And I believe a big part that's neglected is relationships. And now I'm not a love guru. I don't know what it's like to be in a 50-year marriage and what the secrets are for that. But as a man who got divorced, moved to a city, and believes in holistic health, I think there is a healthy way to go about in the dating world. And I think being in the early stages of a relationship can be very detrimental if you are not prioritizing health on a holistic perspective. And that's why it's psychologically, physiologically, and interpersonally, because the interpersonally not only covers the relationship with, on a romantic sense, but it's also the relationship you have with yourself. And I'm very passionate about that since, I was my own worst enemy. And I think a lot of us are. And also how you set boundaries and communicate and nourish relationships with those in your community and your family and your friends. And so I think it's difficult to divorce that, pun intended, from health. And so I like to hold all those together, which has led me to my current niche of helping men in metropolitan areas be the best version of themselves, so that way they can also get into the best relationship possible with the highest caliber woman that they would ever, dream to find themselves with. It's kind of
I love that.
interesting evolution, like I would never have guessed the evolution with that either.
Yeah, totally. Well, it is very interesting. And I would say, I would think that you would find lots of parallels with all kinds of relationships, whether somebody is not in a relationship and they're dating, or they've just started a relationship, or somebody like myself has been married for 7 years. I'm not looking to date anybody, but I'm dating my wife, if you want to call it that. Like, have you found a lot of crossover for helping coach people with relationships, regardless of whether they're in a long-term relationship currently or not?
Yeah, yes and no. I think that there are certain concepts in the early dating stage that do persist in a good way, ideally in a healthy relationship in the long run. Like, one of my theories is always be dating. In fact, this was one that was explicitly stated by my current girlfriend. I hadn't really wrapped my hands around it. Like, it kind of was, teething on it. And she's like, oh no, we just always need to pretend like the dating phase never stopped. I was like, that's it. And I think that's true for a lot of people, because sometimes you get married or you get in a long-term relationship and you think, oh, we're here now, so this stops and something else begins. But it's amazing how the smallest things really keep the romance as slash that feeling that women love so much of being dated or pursued alive. Like flowers, right? Flowers, a sweet note you leave in the kitchen, or just having a 2 or 3 hour window one night a week where it's a date night and you surprise her, even if it's mocktails, right? It doesn't have to be a fancy dinner. It could be mocktails, a picnic in the backyard, or like dancing at home to your favorite music. It's a crazy how, what would you say? Lack of illustrious it has to be in order to really keep this feeling of romance alive. And so I think with guys in the beginning, it's easy to do that. And that's kind of what I help them do, is like, okay, how can we make this special in an authentic way? But then it's like, oh, it never stops. But most of my clients are not, haven't been in relationships, or aren't in a relationship that's been around for 7 years, like your marriage. Most of them are in the stages of having gone through divorce or a breakup, or being stagnant, being single for a while, and they need the accountability to take repetitions and action and experiment, goes back to experiments in the dating world, to figure out what are my non-negotiables and how do I present myself as precisely who I am, not as a representative of who I am, which ultimately I think is the healthiest way to go about dating. But then there are some pieces that I do think translate over. But yeah.
Got it. Okay. So for those people, it's 2024. We have apps. I don't know if you know this, but there are apps you can go to for dating. What are some of the gaps that you're noticing? Where are people lacking and needing to work on to be able to not only attract and find that great partner, but also show up for themselves in their own lives to be the person they want to be?
I think the problem with modernity is similar to health. We have a lot of challenges that are not ancestrally consistent, and the medical narrative is kind of the enemy in the health world, whereas in the dating world, it's almost circumstance, right? I don't know, in my opinion, if the dating world has a nefarious enemy like the health world does to me, in my opinion. It just seems like it's really tough for women to be women and really tough for men to be men. And the health on top of that, hormones are under attack more than ever before. Health is under attack more than ever before. And dating requires insight, courage, radical transparency, patience. All of those things require you to be in a healthy state of mind and body because it will test you. It is a marathon to be, as you know better than me, to be in a 7-year marriage, also to be in the dating world and trying to learn about somebody new and also presenting yourself as unabashedly who you are. And so we have a lot of other factors that make it really tough. And so I think I've noticed men be very overly agreeable, and it seems like, oh, that's, they're being nice and that's accommodating, but in reality it's pandering, and it ends up building resentment in the long run. And you also find yourself in a relationship where the woman thought you were one way, but you're pandering to her and you actually end up being the other way, and it causes a lot of unnecessary strife. And so, and for women, it's different. A lot of women, especially in the Austin area, because I focus mostly on metropolitan areas, are stepping into a more masculine role because they don't have a man to rely on, or maybe they're mistreated by a man. And so they say, okay, I'm going to be the breadwinner for myself. I'm going to be the businesswoman. I'm going to be in this masculine role. I'm going to take charge. And while I don't think that there's anything wrong with that, it's difficult for them to toggle into a more feminine role when they are in a relationship. So again, I don't blame men or women for these things. I think it's a crisis of culture and modernity that makes it difficult for people to be in these roles that lead to partnership. Because if a man is dating a woman but he's in a feminine role, the majority of the time they butt heads. If a woman is dating a man and she's in the masculine role, the majority of the time they're going to butt heads. So there's this idea of toggling, right? Like in your business and in your pursuit of things, you have to toggle from masculine or from feminine to masculine. But then when you can be more playful and things aren't so serious, you need to toggle into the more feminine role. And that also goes with each individual, right? Like I don't want to be hyper masculine all the time, right? Like it's fun to kind of let loose, be a little chaotic, unstructured, and playful and silly. And I think every man needs to do that. And I think every woman should be able to, stand up for herself, not be pushed around, and take action and direction when needed. But again, maybe it's the inverse. Maybe it's 20% of the time that they're that way. And so I think there's this idea of toggling from one mode to the other, and also having the discernment and experience to know when you should be in what mode. And a lot of us are unaware. I know I was. That was part of what led to a lot of issues in my marriage. I was married for 5 years, and 3 years of that were the hardest 3 years of my life. And it's because I didn't have enough of a spine. And it's because, or sometimes I didn't have enough of a spine, and sometimes I was so hyper masculine, I couldn't understand her needs and emotions. And also there were things that she did as well, right? It takes two to tango. I firmly believe that. But I experienced what it was like to be a pseudo version of what I think a man should be. And that certainly leads to problems.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Tell us about the difference between being authentic to ourselves, but also being compromising. This kind of goes along with what you were just saying. But as I heard you and Tony kind of talk about this, it occurred to me that like I want to be the most authentic version of myself, but also like if I'm authentic to that version of myself when I was single, that means I'm playing ice hockey 4 days a week and I'm not spending a lot of time at home. You know what I mean? Like there's got to
Yeah.
be some compromise there. How do you help coach people around that?
I would say if we parse it out into free time and hours, and this is obviously towards men because it's very logical, right? Like if we can compartmentalize these things, it's what is the bare minimum that you need to do for yourself in order to be the best version of yourself? And I don't know the answer to that. It's different for everyone. But if you can meet those needs while also meeting the needs of whoever you're in a relationship with or whoever depends on you or whatever your job requires, then it's a win-win. And it might not fit perfectly like that, but I think a lot of people are or people. They think it's either this or that. I'm an and person. I want to say it's kind of like, have you read the book where they talk about the black swan of negotiation?
I have not.
And of course, I'm going to forget the title of this book, but there's this guy who is a negotiator, um, talks about how there's always a possibility that you don't know exists entering a negotiation that both parties are going to be amenable to, that it's going to be beneficial for both perspectives. So a lot of times when we enter a scenario and think, well, I want to play ice hockey 4 times a week, but she wants to have date night on the same night that I played ice hockey, so that can't work. It's like, well, what if there's another league 30 minutes outside of town that I can go on a different day, and so I can do this the day night with her, and we can both get what we want. Maybe that's a bad example, but something along those lines. And I just like, it's fun to challenge guys, because I don't always have the right answers, but we're really good problem solvers. So if you say, hey, instead of or, think and, what can you possibly do about it? And you kind of displace the responsibility on them. People are wildly ingenuitive and creative in coming up with these solutions. And it's so funny. There's almost never an occasion where it has to be or. So I think it's more of a reframe than anything.
Yeah, that's very pragmatic. Tell us about your current work and what you expect to have happen in the next few months. I know you're always really busy and obviously lots of change in the recent past, but I know you've got a lot coming up. So what do you have going on?
So outside of doing a lot more speaking gigs, because podcasts, webinars, panels, Q&As, doing a lot of those live and or on Zoom or whatnot is great. But Hack Your Health was the first presentation of that nature that I've done, and I loved it so much. So there's a few other events here in Austin in the next few months I'll be speaking at, and I'm so excited to do more of that kind of speaking, because I don't know if you've ever done something like this, Casey, but you do it for the first time and you can't describe why. It's somewhat ineffable, but you're like, this is important. I have a natural attraction to it. This is something special. I need to invest in it more. And that's how I feel about speaking. So I'm excited to do a lot more of that. And I've also been working on a book long before I decided that this was going to be my niche. A year ago, actually 11 months ago, I started writing a book for men on modern dating, basically going what I went through divorce, moving to a new city, and establishing guidelines to date with efficiency, kindness, integrity, and honesty, and how that brings so much peace of mind. And because a lot of guys think that dating is this, taxing, tumultuous, toxic, all these bad T words kind of experience. But I'm like, oh, it's actually one of the best modes to personal development. If you can check your integrity and hold that intact, and also be intentional with how you do it. So I started writing this book, not realizing it would be related to what I wanted to do for business. And I think partially it took some time for me to shift my identity away from heart and soil and more towards to what I was passionate about, which makes me a hypocrite, because like what I said earlier, everyone should go for what they're passionate about, because you'll never be unhappy with how that plays out. Yet I forgot that when I started my business, and I did what was rational versus what I was driven towards. So anyhow, I hope the book will come out in the next calendar year. I've been working on it very voraciously, and I like it a lot. But it's a guide for men in modern dating. So those are the big things coming up, man. But the little things that are coming up, I really love Austin, and I'm sure that there's some other cities like it, but I think it's pretty unique. So the little things are just, I'm getting better at volleyball. I'm learning a lot in my own relationship. I love spending time with my dogs, and I'm just excited to learn about life, about business, about health, about relationships, because that's the experimenter in me, right? It's like there's always something else to learn, and it would be really boring and honestly a terrible world if we didn't have this continuous learning process, as arduous as it might feel sometimes.
Yeah, that's fantastic. You are in a great spot. I have to say, visiting Austin a few years in a row, it's a really cool, unique place. And yeah, to play volleyball and get better at that and enjoy the city that you're in, I think is fantastic, man. This has been an awesome conversation. Certainly learned a lot and coming away with a lot of like really good practical tips that I think anybody can do. And it was super interesting to learn about your experience with Heart and Soil and how that kind of gave you some different, I guess, perspective on how to help people with, diet and lifestyle and all that other stuff. So Chris Bates, where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you and your work?
Bates Dates on Instagram, as well as Bates_dates on YouTube. And then I have a free book on hormone optimization. It's specifically tailored to men, but I do think there's some really helpful things in there for women. It has to do with practical things like we talked about, mostly like routine from a daily, weekly perspective of what people can do. Because I think in order for men to have better dates, they've got to have their hormones dialed in, because it leads to motivation, courage, body composition, all these things. But I think, yeah, any human could take advantage of that. So that's at batesdates.com. And yeah, man, look out for me on more podcasts. And I just want to say thank you for having me on, because, we met briefly, but I don't take it lightly for people like you who work really hard on their podcast to come on and be able to talk about myself so much. In fact, I feel guilty sometimes doing that, but I know that's the name of the game. And so I'll get over it. But I just want to say thank you for having me on and being very intentional with your questions. I don't take it lightly.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words. And one of my favorite things about podcasting is to help expose people out there in the world that are doing really, really good work who need to get that message shared. And you're certainly one of those people. And I'm really happy to say that we met and I can call you a great friend. And I just really appreciate everything that you do and appreciate you taking the time to be on our show today, man. We really appreciate you.
Yeah, it's kind of you too. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio. Oh, fuck. I don't know what I'm going to do with that. That was the time that I pushed the wrong button.
Oh, yeah?
And I cut the music off as I was talking. I'll go back and edit that later.
I mean, I like the soundboard, man. I would love your perspective, because I feel like I was more disorganized with my thoughts than I normally am on this one. So if that's true, I apologize. But also maybe I'm just being hard on myself. I'm not sure. And I'm not fishing for compliments, by the way. I would love your honest opinion of how it went, because I want to refine this skill set.
It's funny that you say that, because I thought that like the first thing I was going to tell you as I got off of this is I feel like I was so scattered with my questions. So really? I'm going to say, when you have a host that is scattered with their questions, you might feel like it's you, but it was probably me.
I don't know if that's true, because I meant what I said. I thought there were really good questions, and I thought like you kind of pieced together my storyline, and you were asking insightful questions geared towards the listener. So yeah, this isn't me being overly agreeable. I didn't think that at all. I just thought this is my weakness. I love to offer a lot of context, and I know that a podcast is a good place to go down a rabbit hole, but I haven't mastered like, okay, how far is too far and how far is not far enough. So that's what I'm trying to get better at.
Gotcha. I thought you did wonderful. And in fact, if you don't mind, can we re-record that last little bit? I want to make sure that I do it right and not fuck it up.
Sure. So, yeah, I'll follow your lead, of course.
If I just ask you where people can go to find you and connect with you and your work, if we can just re-record that would be perfect.
Of course. Yeah.
Okay, so just whenever you're ready, now.
Oh, you want me just to start with that? Okay.
Let me start this over one more time.
Okay,
ready and anytime.
So on Instagram, Bates Dates is where people can find me. I like to throw up some practical tips and I like to add some humor into all that stuff too, just because the world needs more of that. You can find me Bates_dates on YouTube, and then Bates.com is my official coaching site. And I do have a free resource on there. It's a practical guide to optimizing hormones, because I believe that is the first step to men bettering themselves, not only to have better dates, but just a higher quality life, but especially better dates. And I think there's some tips in there that women would find helpful as well. I'm very proud of that. It took me a while to put it together, and it's a nice little ebook. And yeah, man, I wanted to say thank you for having me on, because I don't take it lightly to have access to people's platforms and podcasts that they've worked really hard on. And I thought you asked really great questions. So it means the world, and I don't take it lightly. And I hope whoever's listening to this, they can walk away with something that's helpful.
Well, I'm sure they will. This was such a great conversation with, again, so many like practical tips. And one of my favorite things about podcasting is to be able to expose the listeners to people out there who are doing really, really good work who I believe don't have enough exposure yet. And you're going to get there for sure. And yeah, I'm so happy to hear that you're doing more speaking, because you used the word when you said it, like natural. You are a natural speaker. You deserve to be on stage. You deserve to be on platforms. And we're certainly grateful that you would take the time to be on ours as well. Really appreciate your content and appreciate that really fun discussion today. Really appreciate it.
That's very kind, Casey. Yeah, appreciate it. We'll do it again, I'm sure.
I sure hope so. That'll be great. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.